Hello, everybody. This is the psychology of abnormal behavior, and this is part two of depressive disorders. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the etiologies, the beginnings of major depressive disorder, and perhaps any form of depression that you might care to name, there being several. We've talked about major depressive disorder already. So, what about self-perception and families? What kinds of things do we see then? We see, first of all, that people who are depressed or who become depressed are people who have unsurprisingly, negative view of the world, of themselves, and the future. This is a kind of a triad, if you will, and these are internal views. These are stable attributions of things like self-blame, of the way the world operates. We see a correlation in those who become depressed with critical and unsupportive families. That's something that also should not surprise you, nor should another risk factor and etiology for depression be parental abandonment. And the last is an attachment process that is somehow anxious. None of that should be surprising to any of us, really. I want to talk about the cycle of biological things and just remind you that virtually all things that we talk about in abnormal psychology, when we're speaking of individual diagnoses, are related to both biological causes and negative life experience. So both environment and biology, nature and nurture, if you will. So there are biological causes and there are negative life experiences which raise the risk of depression, which then, interestingly, usually raises the risk of social rejection. So just for a moment here, recognize that. That's my dog scratching over here. Recognize that while people who are acting sad and emanating what is obviously a problem elicit in others caretaking. But over time, when the caretaking does not seem to be working, not seem to be useful, you guys can stop the scratching anytime you want. Then people begin to withdraw from that effort. And in addition, when you don't know someone or in a group of people you don't know, people cut a wide swath, a wide circle around you when you exhibit depressive symptomatology. And then that is what constitutes additional negative life experiences. So that's another way to look at the vicious cycle of depression, anyway. Another is the issue of social skills. So if you have poor social skills, which means that you don't know how to adjust your behavior in light of the situation you are in, that you don't know how to stop and start conversations with people in a relatively fluid way, that you don't know how to comfort people in emotional distress, that you don't know how to be assertive when it's called for, those kinds of things. When you don't have those kinds of skills, then you're going to acquire fewer reinforcers in the environment, fewer rewards, such as good friends or good jobs or whatever it might be. Yeah. Now, what often happens then also with poor social skills is you tend to look for rejection because your lack of skills creates an irritability and a pessimism because you're not really getting what you need from the environment on average with poor social skills. And then lastly, with poor social skills, you tend to start to gravitate toward people who are going to confirm your negative self-views or views of the world. And all of that increases one's vulnerability for depression, yes? Yeah. And then if we talk about the way we think, concerning its relationship to the development of depression, we can think about things like negative thinking as it blames personal setbacks on personal inadequacies. So oftentimes people who do not function well enough, sometimes related to biology, sometimes related to poor social skills, all sorts of things, we've talked about a few of them, they tend to blame themselves. They may focus on negative events. We see that experimentally, of course. They tend to make unreasonably pessimistic projections about what's going to happen next. Yeah. And they will draw negative conclusions about their own personal worth, which then damages self-esteem. And all of these things increase our vulnerability for depression. Yeah. Now, if you look at how much is environment and how much is genetics, just as a big categories, they're huge categories. It's very difficult to tell, but one of the things that we can look at is the incidence of depression in identical twins and fraternal twins. So identical twins are clones. They have the same genetics. They differ only in such things as fingerprints and footprints, you might know. And their genetic relatedness, therefore, is 100%. And so what we see is when one identical twin has depression, the percentage of the time that the other one develops depression is around 65-66%. Yeah, that's a lifetime risk. So that's a concordance rate in percentage, actually. Fraternal twins share 50% of their genetics. They're two separate eggs that are fertilized. An identical twins are one fertilized egg that splits in two. So fraternal twins, 50% relatedness genetically. When one fraternal twin develops depression, we can expect a concordance rate of about 15% as a lifetime risk. And so 15% is higher than the prevalence in the normal population as a lifetime risk. So we know from those two things, particularly from the identical twins, that there is a genetic component to the development of depression. But if it were 100% genetic, the concordance rate in identical twins would be 100% since they're genetically identical. And it's not. See? Interesting. So, how do we treat depression? Well, there's antidepressants. There's four or five kinds, depending on how you look at it. There's tricyclic antidepressants, the TCAs, the MAOIs, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors like Parnate and Nardil. The TCAs are exhibited by, say, Elavil. And the next category would be the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or the selective serotonin reuptake and norepinephrine inhibitors, the SSNRIs, and the atypicals, the ones that don't belong in any of those categories. So there's lots of things we can try. Generally, they try the SSRIs to start with, and some of the older ones are very good and very cheap. Prozac's a penny a pill. That still is a good choice to start with. So that's okay. Start with 20 milligrams and then titrate it in one direction or another. Another possibility, though, is what's called electroconvulsive therapy. And I have a video for you to copy and paste into your search window in the PowerPoint. And I always want to say a few things about that. It is still unknown as to why putting electricity into the brain, causing a convulsion, essentially, which is the goal, resets everything. Maybe it's a bit like pulling the plug on a stuck computer, a hard restart, right? But we don't know why. We do know that new cells grow in the hippocampus, and it stops the loss of cells in the hippocampus, a critical part of the brain connected to several things, including memory. The side effects at the most would be usually just slight and temporary memory loss. It's not like it used to be, ECT. It's not like that at all. If you think it's like one in one flew over the cuckoo's nest. It's not like that. That's an old movie. When they put too much juice through the brain and the wattage was a little too high, and they didn't give sedation, they didn't give muscle relaxation, bad things happened. Now they give very tiny little 1 second or so low voltage and tiny wattage, tiny, and you're asleep. I very much so, asleep, and muscle relaxant. Okay, they monitor you. They have a whole crew: an anesthesiologist, a psychiatrist, a technical person, a nurse, and so forth. So you watch very carefully. They screen you for things like heart stuff and epilepsy, and they're very careful about who they do and don't give this to. They don't go right to this kind of treatment for depression unless it's so severe a depression and the person is suicidal. Then it would be inappropriate to not go to a treatment that is so effective. It's more effective and than in general than talk therapy, which we have talked about before, which I'll revisit in a moment, and medication. Now, the average number of sessions is about 9 or 10 or so. You may get 1, 2, or 3 a week. It may go on for as many as 20 sessions or more. You may go 6 to 10 sessions without seemingly any improvement, while other people improve more quickly. But it does have a stigma, and we want to honor the stigma and destigmatize it, right? Because it's not the way it used to be. The only thing I want to add is a little bit on psychotherapy. So here's the way this goes. When you have mild depression, we go to psychotherapy number 1. Okay? When we have moderate to severe psychotherapy, in the absence of suicidal ideation, we go to psychotherapy and may, and certainly with severe depression, also go to medication. If none of those work in the long run, say for example, mild depression either gets worse or doesn't get any better in the long run with just therapy, we would put in some medication. If moderate to severe depression doesn't work and or gets worse, or what develops is suicidal ideation, or there's worsening disability as a result of the depression, well, not only will we continue to give psychotherapy and medication, then we will begin to discuss ECT. Okay? All right. So let's talk now about a second form of depression, and it is called persistent depressive disorder. That's a rename. It used to be called dysthymic disorder or dysthymia. And I gotta tell you, this is a really different kind of depression. It's really not the same, and the etiology of this is probably not as biological as many examples of major depressive disorder. Many people actually think, as do I, that persistent depressive disorder is actually a consequence of personality factors. And at one time, long time ago, it was really more likely to be thought of in that way. Yeah. If I'm remembering correctly, it was even available on the Axis 2. Okay, so what is this dysthymic disorder, or what we now call persistent depressive disorder? It's kind of like a junior grade depression. Symptoms are similar, but there's fewer of them. They're less severe. But this is a chronic condition, so we have to demonstrate that the symptoms are not just 2 weeks in length of time present, but in children and adolescents 1 year, and in adults 2 years before we can diagnose it. It's supported by cognitive distortions and neuroticism. And of course, you can have both major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder. And some people call that double depression, which is kind of I guess that's just a descriptive term that kind of makes sense. So, again, this can be mild, moderate, and severe. All disorders can be mild, moderate, and severe. If it's mild, it does not really disable anyone. Even in moderate forms, it may not disable anyone. At severe levels, it can be, but mostly in the form of losing friends or not being able to keep friends, or just associating with people who support that negative view that they typically hold. The sadness that they have that's not deeper than a mild major depressive disorder level of sadness might be. But it's not fun to be around somebody with this negativistic kind of depression. Okay? So there's an early onset, that's before 21, and a later onset, 21 and older. So early onset maybe has more genetic component. Everything has some, but when I say it has very little, if none, I really think particularly the later onset is more about personality, particularly the later onset. So, okay, prevalence is somewhere around 1%. So it's not common. If you look at a map of a prevalence map, you don't see much variation across the map from state to state, county to county. You don't really see it. Okay. The risks same as major depressive disorder. Now, we can see that negative affectivity, that neuroticism, right? You may also see anxiety disorders which give rise to what looks like this disorder. And if it's severe, you do see poor global functioning. Yeah. Particularly in the form of relationships, and then consequently maybe at work too. Environmental risks, same. Genetic, maybe even some brain abnormalities. Okay. We're not sure. Okay. Now, if you were going to say that this disorder has a personality component, you would look for what personality traits and what personality disorders might you see with this that might get diagnosed. Okay. What traits? Well, traits associated with the cluster B and cluster C personality disorders, particularly dependent personality disorder and avoidant personality disorder. Those are two that often get diagnosed with this one. At least the traits, and I'm all about the traits, moving to personality disorders for the most part, not all in all cases, but removing many of the personality disorders and using a trait system only. It makes a sense, and when we talk about personality disorders, I will go over this. Treatment, almost anything, but it depends mostly on the client. Okay? You could use CBT, but you could use Gestalt. You could use existential. You could use psychodynamic. You could use client-centered. Sure. Maybe even psychoanalytic. Even if you got the money and the time, I got the chair. I got the couch. Okay, not me. I don't use that form of therapy. Now there's an offshoot kind of major depressive disorder that used to be its own disorder. And it was called Seasonal Affective Disorder, or SAD. Sad. Good acronym for this. Seasonal Affective Disorder. But it's called now it's a qualifier. It's a way of saying this is a subtype of major depressive disorder. And these folks are vulnerable to shifts in sunlight. So generally speaking, folks begin to develop depressive symptoms when sunlight subsides. It could be winter depression, or there could even be a fall and spring pattern. It's either the beginning of the loss of light or at some point. But there's a rhythm is the point. There's a timing that may be a little different for each person. Prevalence rates are about 4 to 6%, but the prevalence depends on what latitude you live in. So the higher the northern latitude you live in, the greater the prevalence. That tells you right away there's an environmental trigger for the depressive symptoms. For some people, the symptoms can be severe. For others, they are just mild. Everything in between. It varies. One of the patterns you sometimes see is that the symptoms are opposite for major depressive. So in many cases of seasonal depression, which is the phrase I would use actually, seasonal depression. For example, there's an increase in weight that's more common than a decrease in weight, which is more common in major depressive disorder. Okay, so more appetite, more weight gain. They may sleep more than hypersomniac as opposed to hyposomniac. So they have more sleep. They're more likely to be in bed sleeping and dozing and so on than you see in major depressive disorder, in which people are more likely to have delayed onset sleep or early awakening kinds of insomnia. Okay. So how do we treat this? Well, number one, sunlight exposure. So the brain has systems that are connected to light and dark that are activated or deactivated. One of those is vitamin D production. Yeah. Lighter skinned people make more vitamin D than darker skinned people in the presence of sunlight. But that's not the only thing that happens. There is a serotonin component as well. So what you can say is human beings were at least some of the time supposed to be in at least indirect sunlight. If you have very fair skin like I have such fair skin that I don't actually tan. I simply burst into flames. But indirect sunlight is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So when you can't get that, if you are prone to this disorder and you are in a latitude that's high north, say Alaska, Anchorage, or any other city or village in Alaska or Canada that's high, way up high towards the Arctic Circle, like Barrow. I think that's the northernmost U.S. city, isn't it? Or town. At any rate, then there are parts of the year, maybe months and months and months, where you get no sunlight. The sun is, in some cases, circling low, but in other cases, it's actually gone because of the relationship of the tilt of the axis of the Earth relative to the sun. So anyway, phototherapy can be used, and this involves using full spectrum light bulbs that you can now even get at Lowe's or whatever, and put them in a light box. Get about 4 of them, and there's a whole protocol for this. They have certain lumens of full spectrum light for a certain amount of time in a certain way. So you're actually sitting, in some cases, with your clothes off, and in some cases you're looking at the light for a certain number of seconds and then turning away. There's a whole thing involved here in a protocol that you follow. If you don't believe me, I will tell you that in bars within Anchorage, there are photo boxes sitting on the bar that have this, and you look into them. They're like a frame that you put your face in, and you close your eyes and occasionally look at it, and then close your eyes again. This actually is supposed to lighten mood. Apparently, it does. I haven't tried those, but this phototherapy is a really useful thing for many people. Another possibility is melatonin supplement. So some people do not make enough melatonin in their pineal gland, and taking a supplement is relatively harmless. And what it does is it prepares your physiology for sleep. It doesn't put you to sleep. It prepares you for, in other words, it sets the table for the meal to come, which is sleep. And then in some cases, when it's severe, we want to give people short-term antidepressants for the periods during which their pattern has established itself, and we know when it's coming. We can pin it down within a couple of weeks or so, and we can begin ahead of that a course of of antidepressants and then decrease them once that period is over. But we have to have the pattern established. Okay, so that's part 2 of depression and depressive disorders. See you next time.